almost 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He's a psychodynamic therapist, and of course, understanding the story behind the symptoms, survivor, clinician, and founder, none other than Dr. Vassilia Binensztok.
Hi, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for having
Welcome.
me, Daniel.
Welcome, Dr. Vassilia on Book 1 Review. Can you please introduce more about yourself that I mess?
Of course, yeah, I am a psychotherapist. I own a group practice. I still do practice myself, though, and my specialty is adults with childhood trauma, complex trauma, and anxiety disorders, which trauma often feeds into. So, the connection between those two. I was also a professor for 10 years of counseling and psychology, and I've written several publications, including textbooks on psychotherapy theories.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Dr. Vassilia Binensztok. Thank you. And today let's talk about how childhood experiences shape adult anxiety, relationships, and health. Let's start with the fundamental concept. How does child developing nervous system and brain architecture literally get wired by early experiences, creating a blueprint for future anxiety or resilience?
That's a great question. And I'm glad that you added resilience in there as well, because a lot of times, especially in my profession, we're looking at deficits, we're looking at things that we need to improve upon, harm that's been done. And a lot of times people don't focus enough on resilience and even what we call post traumatic growth, which is growing in your personality and your personal development in spite of a trauma or sometimes even because of a trauma. So in our early childhood, especially before age 7, even in infancy, so even when we're not having fully coherent thoughts like we do later on, thoughts and words, we are shaped by our environment, and we have a lot of questions that we ask on an unconscious level. So say in infancy, a child might ask the question of, am I safe? Will the people who are supposed to take care of me take care of me? Now, obviously, that's not a conscious thought, right? An infant can't have that thought, but on the unconscious level. So the part of our brain that is working outside of our awareness, the thoughts that we have are just the brain signals that are coming into our prefrontal cortex and coming into our awareness. But our brains are doing a lot more than that, even been shown to be making decisions before we're even aware of what those decisions are. So, on the unconscious level, an infant has to know the general question of, is the world safe? So if your parents or your caregivers are consistent, if they anticipate your needs, so say they know you're on a feeding schedule, not just wait until you're really crying to feed you, and if they show you a lot of love and affection and speak to you in a sweet voice like we often do to babies, then you learn that at least in your immediate environment the world is safe, and that leads you to become somebody who believes that the world is safe on a general level, even later on into adulthood, of course, unless other things happen that might change that. But that blueprint is set really early. So if your
Mm.
caregivers, on the other hand, they're very inconsistent, or they're erratic, sometimes they meet your needs, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're loving, sometimes they're neglectful or punishing, then you learn a different lesson. And then on an unconscious level, you carry the beliefs that maybe people can't be trusted, that you have to be on your own. You might turn out to be very hyper independent or even avoidant, or turn completely within yourself, or you might feel that you have to earn love. So even back into infancy, you can trace our behavioral patterns all the way back there into adulthood. And then, of course, all the other years. That's just one example. So, throughout our childhood, we have experiences like that that inform our unconscious, which informs our body, our nervous system to anticipate certain things, believe certain things, and therefore, like, feel and act in a certain way.
Many people have a hard time connecting their current struggles to their childhood. Beyond obvious trauma, what is the more subtle good enough childhood dynamics like emotional neglect and chronic parental stress that can powerfully shape adult life.
Yeah. Um, we call those little T's. So, like you're saying, there are big traumas, we call them big T's, and we can usually think of them as big events of abuse or living through being a victim of a crime or something like that. And then we have little T's. So, those are small events that usually people dismiss as not traumatic, but they can be traumatic, especially when they add up over time. So, either you have a lot of them or they are chronic, so they're kind of long lasting, they can add up to have the same effects as a big T trauma. So that could be something like even your teacher humiliating you, embarrassing you in front of your classmates, or something like that. Or, like you said, it could be chronic parental problems. A lot of times people feel that whatever they experienced wasn't really that bad, that they really didn't experience abuse or neglect because they had their needs met on the surface level. Maybe their family had resources, they had a nice home, they had two cars, they went to a private school, and they never really wanted for anything material. And so people who have that experience have a hard time looking back and saying, maybe I did experience some abuse or neglect or even like emotional abandonment because of what you don't see, right? So you don't see parents that are maybe depressed themselves, that don't know how to lovingly connect to a child because maybe they didn't receive that as kids themselves, or who just straight up dismiss their children, or don't really have a good hand in raising them actually. And chronic stress for parents, kids absorb that too. You try to hide things from your kids, but they see it. If a parent loses a job, if parents are always worried about money, if they don't get along with each other, kids kind of pick up on that stress, and the parent becomes less attuned to the child. So, when we're stressed, we kind of go into ourselves. It's really hard to tap into our emotional resources, right? Even as adults, to be loving, to be warm, to be generous when we're under a lot of stress. Like, we have to preserve our resources and deal with that stress. So, if you think about what kids aren't getting in situations like that, you learn really subtle lessons, like that maybe your emotions aren't that important. You might come to conclusions that aren't true. So children don't understand the world, and when they come to conclusions, they're usually not true. So usually, if their parents are kind of emotionally neglectful, they start to believe that they aren't worthy, that they're a burden. They usually don't place the blame on the parents. They usually place it on themselves somehow. And then those beliefs really become ingrained, and we end up still believing them on some level in adulthood.
Hmm. Very well said, Miss or Dr. Vasila. Very well said. We often hear about attachment styles. Can you explain how a child's early attachment patterns don't just perfect feature romantic relationships, but become the unconscious template of how they relate to bosses, friends, or even their own health?
Yeah. So your attachment style forms very, very early. It forms in infancy. That doesn't mean that those things can't be changed later on. It's just harder to change. It's like a child can learn a language more easily as a young child than you can as a 45-year-old adult, because the brain loses some plasticity. So it can be changed, but those attachment styles are set really, really early in infancy. And it all depends on how our caregivers interact with us. So it's kind of like I described at the beginning. If your parent anticipates your needs and meets them and shows a lot of love and affection and warm touch and vocalization, you can form a secure attachment style, which means that on a general level, you believe the world is secure. You can be on your own, but you can also be attached to people, and you kind of have a good give and take between the two. Where if your parent is erratic, the child has to decide what to do with that. So they either become very needy and very dependent, and desperate for that affection, or they turn within themselves and they become very avoidant, in which case, even later on in life, they might feel suffocated by attention and affection, or they become what we call disorganized, which is kind of rotating between those other styles and not really being able to find a good attachment to anyone. So there was a researcher named Philip Shaver who brought this into adulthood. Early on, we would look at attachment just in children and talk about behavioral issues that they had and how they might be related to attachment. So it was only years later that researchers started to look at, does your attachment actually affect your relationships in adulthood? Does it really last that long? And what we've seen is yes, it does. So a lot of people who maybe had an insecure, anxious attachment, which is like those people who become needy and really are scared of losing their attachment, they can keep that on into adulthood. So they might not see that with friends, but they usually will see it with a relationship, like a romantic relationship, that's just, a lot more emotionally provoking. And so they might need constant reassurance that the person is still interested in them. They might constantly think about a person or romanticize a relationship. Even if they can't have it, they might feel very anxious about whether their relationship is true or whether it's going to last. And then that informs their behavior in the relationship. They might call a lot or ask for a lot of reassurance or pursue relationships that aren't good for them. And in the psychodynamic theory, we also have something that we call the repetition compulsion, which is the unconscious need to continue to repeat a pattern in order to change that pattern and fix it. And so, if your parent didn't ever give you the kind of love or approval you needed and wanted, you might find yourself trying to get that out of relationships in order to finally heal that wound. Unfortunately, that usually doesn't happen. It usually doesn't help. But a person might find themselves in getting into other relationships where people are withholding that love. And then what they do is they kind of repeat what they did in childhood, which is try to win that love, try to win the affection, try to convince the person to give it to them somehow, some way, try to be good enough for them, in the unconscious hope that that will change the person and they will finally understand that, yes, they can be loved. They just need to do everything the right way. And it's just not something that works. Unfortunately, we need to focus on healing ourselves rather than trying to make a person who's not interested in us in order to heal us and what we believe about ourselves. But that's just one example. So all those attachment styles have their own ways of behaving in relationships, and sometimes the attachment styles can change. So a couple where one is very preoccupied and one is very avoidant, if the preoccupied becomes avoidant, the avoidant can sometimes become preoccupied, because now all of a sudden that dynamic is shifting. And so on some level, we're acting out these things that ultimately go back to just not feeling safe in childhood, not feeling really safe in our primary relationships when we were little.
Well, very well said, Dr. Vassilia. So let's talk about the hope, resilience, and post traumatic growth. In the narrative, is it not all deterministic? We are the factors that foster resilience. How can someone individuals experience a significant childhood adversity and still develop into secure, healthy adults?
There are so many factors that go into this. And like I said earlier, I think resilience isn't studied enough. But there are a number of factors that they've shown resilient children do have. And a lot of times it's external. Some of it is internal, some of it is external. But like you said, it's not deterministic. We can always grow and change. We can always have better coping skills. But resilient children, they have found, they tend to get their needs met in other ways. So say their parents aren't very kind or warm to them, they might turn to teachers. They might go to a friend's house a lot, and who has a really nice parent who is a good influence on them. And they kind of piece together these things in their life that they don't have at home, not necessarily on purpose, but it's just a trait that resilient kids tend to have. And so if you didn't have that, or you just didn't have that available to you, a child can still, and an adult can still learn how to start getting needs met in a healthy way and become more resilient. So you can build resilience by building some of the practices that we see naturally resilient people and resilient kids have, which is really interesting.
Yes, definitely. And let's talk about the neuroplasticity. How does the adult brain's ability to rewire itself after hope for changing these deep seated patterns even decades later?
Yeah. Our brains are very plastic, which means they are malleable, they are changeable. What does that actually look like? Is that our neurons communicate with each other and they form a chain of communication in order for us to be able to have a thought or do a task. And that's easier to do in childhood because in childhood, we have a lot more neural connections. And we don't need all of those neural connections into adulthood, but we do need them in order to learn. And so at different stages in childhood and adolescent development, we go through something called brain pruning, where the brain will get rid of connections in order to make itself more efficient. And so some of those connections then cannot cannot come back. Typically, they don't need to. But here's a good example of that. If you never learn any sort of language, now this is super rare. There've only been a handful of cases documented like this through history in the world. But if you never learn any language, not your native
Yes.
language, not any language, after a certain age, it will be near impossible to learn any kind of language because the neural connections that are there to learn language are there at a very young age, and then they're pruned away after that age, in which we usually will start picking up and saying words and learning language. So it's harder to change the brain in adulthood, but it's still possible. Essentially, the way that you do it is through a lot of repetition. And
Mm-hmm.
so think about practicing something. If you never knew how to play piano and you start to do it, you will not know how to do it. You'll keep making mistakes. But the more you do it, the more certain things become like second nature to you. And you can think about that with any sort of task that at first you had to concentrate on, focus on, think a lot about, actively try to do, and then becomes like a muscle memory. That's because your brain made those connections and now knows how to do it. And you can do the same thing for how you think. You can do that for behaviors, but it takes a lot of repetition, especially in adulthood when our brains are still changeable, but it's just a little bit harder to do.
Mm-hmm. So it's better people that you learn a lot in the younger age because your brain is like a sponge.
It's easier to learn languages, sports, anything that takes muscle memory, how to play an instrument, anything that basically your brain and your body is communicating without you having to think about it. You can do it at any age, but it's easier to do it as a child.
Yes, and thank you for that, Dr. Basila. Truly, truly empowering. So, what are your short term and long term goals?
Oh, thank you. So I run a business. It's a group practice, and I have a number of clinicians working for me, and it's a really cool thing to do and to be able to lead. So I'm working on that, continuing to grow it, offering intensive programs that last about 6 weeks. I am also starting my own podcast called The Hidden Story, where I interview people and their real stories of resilience and just take a deeper look at some of these psychodynamic unconscious patterns. And working on a lot of writing and working on some personal essays to compile and working on a self-help book. And I guess that leads into my long-term goals. I would love to continue to do that and continue to do it on, larger stages and just help more and more people essentially and help people, have my own story. And so help people relate to that and take something from it that can help them improve.
Yes, good luck for that, Dr. Basila, and looking
Thank you.
forward for more success. And what would be your piece of advice for those people out there who want to be like you, entrepreneur, therapies, and many more?
Yeah, there's so much advice to give, but I would say one thing is, and this might sound weird, is like don't think too hard about it. So, I'm an
Yes.
overthinker myself. And so that doesn't mean, just be careless or reckless or don't put any planning. You have to do planning. I strategic plan for my business. But don't think yourself out of an idea. If you really have an idea and you want to pursue it, even if you don't know what it's going to look like, just start throwing something out there, because they usually take shape as you're working on them. So if you want to write a book or do something like that, just start getting words on paper, even if you don't even know how they go together, because it'll come together as you do it. So don't stop yourself before you start.
Yes, people, start now and stop procrastinating. So, thank you for that advice, Dr. Vasila. And can you please recommend a book or books that influence your journey?
Sure. Yeah, I think, I read a lot of like technical books now. A lot of people like that book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. It's an interesting book, but I would go into more of his other work about complex trauma. So he and some colleagues wrote about trying to get complex trauma to become an official diagnosis. And that could be very, very interesting to understand the nuances of it. I also recently have been into a book called the Psychoanalysis of Medicine. So, looking at the ways that psychology influences our health. I love Gabor Mate's books. And so I'm just really interested in that mind body connection.
Yes, mind body connection. Thank you for that recommended book, Miss Dr. Vassilia. So, to before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in sixth season, abstract poetry in third season, and my book 101 review in sixth season as well, comedy 101 in a third season, Food 101 in sixth season, Geography 101, Love Letters, Movie 101, Review, Music 101, our fifth season, Science 101, Sex 101, fourth season, Trivia 101, Law 101, Mental Health 101, Motivation 101, Entrepreneurship 101, and Bible Verses 101 are my baby podcasts. So please listen to them wherever you listen your podcasts. So, Dr. Vasila, finally, what is the most inspiring or hopeful story of transformation you've witnessed that illustrates the power of understanding and healing these childhood roots?
Making me think of a book, one of the most influential books like in my life, by someone named Jeffrey Canada. It's called Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun. And he analyzed the evolution of violence in urban America and told his own story, and a story of how he started a nonprofit that helps kids learn to overcome obstacles, and not turn to violence, but learn to see value within themselves. And the way that he did those programs was just really inspiring to me.
Well, Dr. Vasila, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your advocacy, your projects, or anything you want to promote on Book 101?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, follow me on Instagram, Dr. Vassilia. I also have a Substack, where I write deeper articles about this, Dr. Vassilia on Substack. And then check out my podcast coming out called The Hidden Story. It'll be on all platforms.
Yes, people, let's support Dr. Vassilia Binensztok, because if you support her, for sure, more and more empowering advocacy like this to rise. So, Dr. Vassilia, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Modicon people, see you soon.